And it's also a great pleasure to invite an old friend and colleague, Dr. Sheila Lowe, to address us on the role of coasting in control ovarian stimulation.
This one.
Dr. Sheila Lowe is from Singapore, and
Okay, good morning, everyone. I'd like to thank Dr. Gautam and Dr. Gorel for the opportunity to be here and to present a short talk on coasting in IVF. The hospitality and graciousness has been so warm, and we've enjoyed ourselves here. Just as a preliminary to the topic itself, just touch very briefly on ovarian hyperstimulation and a summary of its effects. Basically, it's a massive fluid shift from the intravascular compartment to the third space, and this results in profound intravascular, depletion and hemoconcentration with excessive fluid accumulation, and this leads to all the symptoms that we know commonly, like bloatedness, breathlessness, and deep vein thrombosis. And all this is due to increased vascular permeability. The severe form is life-threatening and hopefully not lethal nowadays with good management, and we want to prevent this, and it occurs in about 0.1 to 2% of ART cycles, higher incidences in the high-risk group, of course. There are two forms, the early form and the late onset form. And the early onset form is associated with the ovarian response, and the late onset form with the pregnancy-induced HCG. So for today, we're going to talk on the early onset form, because that is where the coasting has thought to have an effect. Now, there are various preventive measures for severe OHSS, and I'm not going to talk on that in this lecture. They all act at different levels in the pathway, and none of them have absolutely prevented OHSS, except perhaps cancellation of the entire cycle. And for today, the area we are going to concentrate on is coasting, and that is stopping the gonadotrophin injections until the serum estradiol level reaches a threshold that you have decided for your center or your population, and that is safe enough to then continue the cycle by triggering ovulation with HCG and continuing with the egg collection. The list here is by no means extensive, and there are several other measures that have been introduced. So looking back at the basic mechanism, when we give gonadotrophin injections, it's to grow the pool of follicles, and that is the aim of controlled ovarian hyperstimulation. But at the same time, the granulosa lutein cell population increases, and with this increase, the estradiol levels increase. It is HCG trigger, however, that starts off the release of the vascular mediators, and therefore causing the increased capillary permeability, leading to the massive fluid shifts which we see in clinical OHSS. So for coasting, what we're going to act on is at the level of the FSH levels by stopping it, so that the granulosa lutein cell population is then diminished. So almost universal is a prerequisite of HCG trigger. This is particularly important because most of the cycles in Asia are still agony cycles. So if we end up with symptoms of OHSS, or at risk of OHSS, we cannot prevent it totally unless we omit the HCG trigger and cancel the cycle. And cancellation, as you know, is associated with high emotional and financial costs and great disappointment for the couple. So what is coasting? Coasting is when we withhold the gonadotrophins at a set threshold of estradiol level, and then continue to monitor the estradiol levels daily till it reaches and drops below another set level, and that's when we initiate the HCG trigger, and that's when coasting ends. In general, most of the studies in the literature have been studied in agony cycles, whether short or long cycles. There were two big studies in antagonist cycles, although that is now a moot point, because with antagonists you can trigger the agonist to reduce the OHSS levels. So this concentrates mostly on agonist cycles. Now when the FSH injections are stopped, what happens is that the mature follicles can still survive, as we know their threshold to continue growth is at a lower FSH requirement. And the basis for coasting is to try to cause atresia or apoptosis of the small and intermediate follicles. And by doing that, as I said before, the granulosa lutein cell population drops, and a marker of this drop is the serum estradiol levels, because we can't actually measure the granulosa lutein cell population easily. And when that drops to a certain so-called safe levels, then we trigger, and the amount of VEGF produced is hopefully lesser, and therefore trying to avoid the massive shifts of fluid with severe OHSS. Velasco in 2004 showed that when you coast, the VEGF as well as estradiol levels actually rise on the first day of coasting. As can see from the serum VEGF levels in the open circles and the closed or colored circles, black dots are the serum estradiol levels, and they mirror each other until the day of HCG. So the purpose of that is to drop that level to a very low level. And when he studied the follicular fluid in individual follicles, and he did this by aspirating one follicle at a time, flushing through the entire system with media before entering the next follicle to ensure he was getting the right fluid from the right follicle, the correct follicle, we can see that the estradiol levels were lower in the coasted group versus the non-coasted group in the top part. However, smaller follicles had a reduced secretion, whereas it was not really significantly dropped in the mature follicles, and that is what we want with coasting. And in the VEGF, concentrations also dropped significantly for both groups. However, it was more dramatic drop in the small follicles. Again, this is what we want with coasting. The follicular diameter actually correlates with the VEGF levels, and this was found by Velasco. But because the population of small and medium follicles was bigger, so when we coasted and if they underwent atresia, the total follicular VEGF significantly dropped, and that's again the aim of coasting, is to cause the atresia of the small follicles. So when he measured the apoptosis percentage, you can see that in coasted groups, it was double the necrosis in a control group. So in other words, apoptosis of the granulosa lutein cells was significantly increased. And this increase affected mainly immature follicles less than 14 mm diameters. And this was again what we want to happen, and was significantly affected, so that the mature follicles continued to grow. And others also had the same kind of results as Velasco. So the number of oocytes retrieved generally was decreased in coasted groups versus control groups. And the rate of oocyte retrieval with respect to follicles was significantly lowered in coasted groups, meaning although they may see the same number of follicles on the scan, only 28% of these follicles had eggs, whereas in your normal control group, as you know, you usually get 90% of your follicles having eggs. And this is again the aim, because we don't want so many in this very high risk group. This is a very busy table, but there's only one line we want to look at, and that is the number of metaphase 2 oocytes and germinal, number of oocytes obtained and egg at oocyte puncture. And it showed that among the study on egg donation, for donors that underwent coasting, they still managed to get the same number of M2 oocytes as well as total number of oocytes as those with coasting. And it seems in contradiction to the earlier statement, but in fact, if you look at the estradiol level at the beginning of coasting for the coasted groups, it was 6,000 picograms per mole, and with coasting of about 4 days, they dropped it down to the same level. In other words, you're bringing the hyper responder into what we call a normal responder group.